bombshell within the last hour. Now, if you haven't seen this yet, I'm gonna put the headline up on the screen here so you can see it. But this is one of those stories where the headline really is only a fraction of the news that they just broke here. This is a big deal, what the Washington Post just published, and there are really two big deals within it. There are two bottom lines to this story that they just broke tonight. The first one is what is reflected in the headline. I'm just going to quote the lead directly here. The CIA has concluded in a secret assessment that Russia intervened in the 2016 election to help Donald Trump win the presidency, rather than just to undermine confidence in the U.S. electoral system. They're citing officials briefed on the matter. Quote, intelligence agencies have identified individuals with connections to the Russian government who provided WikiLeaks with thousands of hacked emails from the DNC and others, including Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman. According to U.S. officials, these individuals are actors known to the intelligence community who are part of a wider Russian operation to boost Donald Trump's chances at winning and hurt Hillary Clinton's chances. A senior U.S. official briefed on an intelligence presentation made to U.S. senators, stick a pin in that sourcing there for a second, that person is then quoted saying this: it is the assessment of the intelligence community that Russia's goal here was to favor one candidate over the other, to help Trump get elected. That's the consensus view. Okay, so that is the first part of this breaking news tonight from the Washington Post. The CIA has told U.S. officials and senators, secretly, that when Russia hacked the emails of Clinton's campaign chair and the DNC, when they fed that information to the U.S. public via WikiLeaks, it wasn't just some chaos plan to make Americans wonder about the integrity of our election system. They weren't just trying to make us feel oogie about voting, right? They weren't just trying to make us feel like our democracy was shaky and vulnerable. It was a specifically directed thing. They were overtly part of a Russian op to try to win the American presidential election for Donald Trump. Okay, so that's one. Here's the other part. And I said stick a pin in that sourcing stuff there for a reason. I think it's always important to pay attention to the sourcing, but particularly on stories like this. And obviously, the reporters from the Washington Post are not going to tell us who their sources are, and we would never ask them to. But they do describe them. They describe their officials, the officials they're talking to, and their sources for the story as, variously throughout the story, officials briefed on the matter, or U.S. officials, or at one point, like I said, stick a pin in it, a senior U.S. official briefed on an intelligence presentation made to U.S. senators. Okay, so that sourcing ends up being a big part of that story, because this assessment by the CIA, this is not a public assessment. The CIA has not made this incredibly inflammatory assessment public. They haven't said overtly to us, to you and me, to citizens, that Russia tried to win the election for Donald Trump. But that assessment is now in the paper. That's now on the front page of the Washington Post. And the reason it is because the CIA didn't keep this assessment to itself. They gave this assessment to people in the U.S. government. And the question is, I think that sort of the most disturbing part of what has just been broken here is how much of this information they gave to people in the U.S. government before the election. And that's, I think, probably the biggest part of this story here. This is totally new tonight. The Post describes what they say was a secret briefing for congressional leaders in September. And again, I'm just going to quote directly here. This has just come out within the last hour, and so I haven't, written this up and given you a big explanatory thing about it. I'm just going to tell you what they got. This is from the Post. By mid-September, White House officials had decided it was time to name and shame the Russian government by publicly blaming Russia for doing this. But they worried that doing so just weeks before the election, unilaterally, without bipartisan congressional backing, that would make President Obama vulnerable to charges that he was using intelligence for political purposes. Instead, officials devised a plan. They would seek bipartisan support from top lawmakers. So they set up a secret meeting with the Gang of 12, the leaders of the House and Senate, the ranking members of the Intelligence Committee and the Homeland Security Committee in both the House and the Senate. That's the Gang of 12. Obama dispatched counterterrorism director Lisa Monaco, FBI director James Comey, Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson. He sent them to go make the pitch to these leaders in Congress for a, quote, show of solidarity and bipartisan unity against Russia interfering in our election. This detail is incredible. In a secure room in the Capitol used for briefings involving classified information, these administration officials broadly laid out the evidence that U.S. spy agencies had collected, showing Russia's role in cyber intrusions in at least 2 states and in hacking the emails of the Democratic organizations and individuals. They made a case for a united bipartisan front in response to what one official described as the threat posed by unprecedented meddling by a foreign power in our election process. Now get this. The Democratic leaders in the room unanimously agreed on the need to take the threat seriously. Republicans, however, were divided. Some of the Republicans in the briefing seemed opposed to the idea of going public with such explosive allegations in the final stages of an election. According to several officials, Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell raised doubts about the underlying intelligence. He made clear to the administration that he would consider any effort by the White House to challenge the Russians publicly to be an act of partisan politics. And then the Post helpfully notes, after the election, Trump chose McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao, as his nominee for transportation secretary. This is stunning stuff, right? I mean, this is just broken within the last hour in the Washington Post. They're reporting that the CIA not only concluded that the Russians intervened in the election, stole information, publicized stolen information to help Donald Trump win the presidency, but the CIA gave its information about Russia to the leadership in the House and the Senate. And the White House wanted to make a big public bipartisan stand against it, and Republicans said no. Mitch McConnell specifically said no. No, don't tell the public. And so we held the election with the leadership in Congress knowing full well what Russia was doing, and we all went to vote while they sat on that. Until now, until the Post published this tonight. Joining us now is Ellen Nakashima. She's a cybersecurity reporter for the Washington Post. She's one of the reporters who broke this story just a little while ago. Ms. Nakashima, thank you very much for joining us. I know that this must be a very busy time for you right now.
Yes, thanks for having me.
So it seems to me, as I just explained, that the big new piece of this is both the CIA's conclusion that Russia was trying to decide who should be the next president of the United States. That's what this intervention was about. But also this information that was given to Congress. Were there multiple times when the intelligence agencies, when the CIA, when this intelligence information was brought to congressional leaders?
Well, we know that the CIA briefed the Senate Intelligence Committee last week with this information, which is partly what prompted a letter, the letter we mentioned in the article, from 7 senators, Senator Wyden among them of Oregon, to President Obama, asking him to declassify information that these senators thought was important for the public to know. These were all Democratic senators who signed the letter. And you know, this is the information, part of the information that was given to them and which the senators felt should be made public.
In terms of what this congressional meeting that you and your colleagues described happening in September, where Jay Johnson and Lisa Monaco and James Comey were all sent to that room that's used for classified briefings on Capitol Hill, and this larger group of Senate and House leadership were briefed on these matters. Do we know specifically what they were told, how the intelligence was characterized in that meeting?
So that meeting was actually more of a meeting to get bipartisan support for a statement that would urge the states to avail themselves of the Department of Homeland Security's help in protecting their election systems from attack, especially at a time when they were being targeted by a very advanced adversary, Russia. So it was an informational session, and during that session there was discussion about also publicly naming Russia as the culprit behind the hacks and the meddling, and some lawmakers even wanted to go further and urged the administration to take a response to deter Russia.
And you're able to characterize the disparate response from those members of Congress who were briefed at that point by saying that the Democratic leaders unanimously agreed that the threat was serious and that presumably there should be some response, but it was a divide among Republican lawmakers, which is the reason why there was no public statement of any kind after that briefing before the election.
There was no bipartisan public statement. What happened after that meeting is when the Democrats could not get, even though there was no consensus from the entire group, two Democratic lawmakers, Senator Dianne Feinstein from California, who's the ranking member on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Congressman Adam Schiff from California, who's the ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee, both put out a statement essentially pointing the finger publicly at Russia and blaming them for the hacks and trying to undermine the election.
Ellen Nakashima, Washington Post cybersecurity reporter. Thank you for helping us understand this story tonight. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. I appreciate it.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
All right. So we have much more to come tonight, including on this story. We had Lisa Monaco, the National Counterterrorism Director, announce today that President Obama has ordered an intelligence review to be completed before he is out of office in terms of what Russia did in this election. But this bombshell tonight from the Washington Post that the CIA knew that Russia wasn't just meddling, Russia was trying to deliver the presidency to Donald Trump. And this news about the partisan difference in terms of the response on Capitol Hill, that members of Congress who are Republican, particularly Mitch McConnell, didn't want the American people to be told what they were being alerted to, whereas Democrats wanted to do that. It is striking. It's striking not only because his wife went on to get a cabinet job from Donald Trump, but it's striking because this is, I think, not what any of us expected to be living through in our lifetime in terms of thinking about the vulnerability of the American political system to our enemies and how American politicians would respond to that with such incredible partisanship. All right, next we will talk to the American who knows more about Russian-American relations than just about anybody else alive. He's here with us live next. Stay with us.
The president has directed the intelligence community to conduct a full review of what happened during the 2016 election process. And to capture lessons learned from that and to report to a range of stakeholders, to include the Congress.
So that was Lisa Monaco this morning, President Obama's counterterrorism advisor. She announced today that President Obama told the intelligence community he wants a full review of Russian interference in this presidential election before he's out of office. Now, of course, the president-elect keeps insisting, despite the intelligence community saying otherwise, that he's sure Russia did nothing to interfere in the election. But both that announcement about the review and that repeated insistence from the president-elect, those were both before the Washington Post's blockbuster report just out within the last hour tonight, which says that not only did the CIA determine that Russia was interfering in the election, they determined that Russia was interfering in the election specifically to try to hand the presidency to Donald Trump. That's why they were interfering. It was to make Trump president. The Washington Post also reporting some disturbing details tonight about members of Congress being given that assessment by the intelligence community and by U.S. officials ahead of the election, and them not wanting anything said about it as we all went to vote, not knowing this, even though they knew it. Joining us now is Michael McFaul. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's now a professor of political science at Stanford. Mr. Ambassador, thanks very much for your time tonight. It's nice to see you.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Let me ask you first about this Washington Post report tonight. We had earlier, obviously, seen this public declaration from the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence saying Russia had meddled in the election. But they didn't say they were trying to elect Donald Trump. I think a lot of us were sort of making that leap. Now we've got the CIA in secret saying, yeah, that's what they were trying to do. They wanted Trump to be president. What do you make of this?
Well, two things I think are especially new for me. And I want to remind you, Rachel, we've been talking about this for months. I wrote a piece about this in the Washington Post, which we talked about in August, but we didn't have the exact data or the CIA connecting the dots. The important piece of this reporting for me is that the CIA now says, you know, in the story, I filtered through the different sources that you rightly pointed out about 10 minutes ago, but that the Russians gave WikiLeaks the data, right? Before we had to speculate about that, the CIA has now briefed these people to say that definitively, and therefore you don't have to be a rocket scientist or have a PhD in Russian studies to say they did that, because WikiLeaks then dropped that data to adversely affect one candidate in this election. So before we had to hypothesize about that, now the CIA is saying it's true.
The CIA also reportedly, or the intelligence community more broadly, I should say, appears to have delivered, according to this reporting, appears to have delivered some of this assessment to members of Congress, to leadership in the House and Senate, and to the heads of the Homeland Security and Intelligence Committees, including in advance of the election, whereupon there was a debate about whether or not the intelligence was good and whether or not the American people should be warned about this. What strikes me in the Washington Post reporting is that they said there was a partisan divide, that the Democrats took this seriously and wanted to put out a statement, wanted to come out and say, we are unified against this. The Republicans didn't. They were at least divided on this issue, and Mitch McConnell was flat out against it. I don't think of intelligence as being that partisan a thing. And I especially don't think of classified intelligence that has to be done in one of those, you know, compartmentalized briefing rooms and all that stuff. I don't think of it as being something that generally engenders a very partisan reaction. Is that part of this reporting a surprise to you, or am I just being naive?
It's not surprising to me, given the election that was at stake. I mean, you know, time and time again, some of us who consider ourselves to be national security experts tried to raise this issue during the campaign, and every time we were derided as, oh, that's just a partisan statement, that's because you're for Hillary Clinton and not Donald Trump. And tragically, even after the election, President-elect Trump has already stated on the record that he doesn't believe this intelligence. So, you know, that is what it was. But moving forward, we have to have a real conversation about national security, not divided between Democrats and Republicans. And that's why there's new legislation. It just dropped a few days ago. It's called Protecting Our Democracy Act. Representatives Cummings and Swalwell have released this. Swalwell, excuse me. Have proposed this, an independent bipartisan commission to investigate this. And with all due respect to my friends in the Obama administration, having them do a 30-day review internally within the U.S. government, that's not enough, because that will be dismissed once the new administration comes in. It has to be independent and bipartisan and a serious scrub of this so that we don't go through this again in 2020.
Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, now professor of political science at Stanford University. Thank you, Professor. It's good to have you here. This is sort of an incredible.
You can see I have a little passion about this, Rachel.
Yeah,
Thanks
me
for
too.
having me on tonight.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for doing the show.
I also want to say that what the ambassador just said there about looking ahead to 2020 and making sure this doesn't happen again. You also heard Lisa Monaco say it in her remarks this morning in terms of having lessons learned about these sort of things. There's also the issue of retaliation, right? I mean, if the United States government interfered in a Russian election to pick the next president of Russia, and Russia found out about it right after that election, don't you think they would retaliate against us somehow? Will there be an American action in response to this, particularly if we know that Russia not only was doing it in order just to be mischievous, they were doing it to get an outcome? Does the fact that they got the outcome they wanted mean that they get away with it? It's hard to believe. Much more ahead here tonight. Stay with us. When the National Counterterrorism Advisor, Lisa Monaco, spoke today at a Christian Science Monitor breakfast, she made a couple of pieces of big news. First, as we discussed earlier, she announced that the Obama administration's ordered a review of what happened with the Russians intervening in the presidential election. But she also dropped a scary little bombshell that as the top counterterrorism advisor in the U.S. government, she hasn't yet met with whoever's going to replace her. Not sure there is a replacement, actually. Quote, I have not met my successor. My successor, to my knowledge, has not been named yet. I am eager to sit down with that person, whoever that person may be, if they ever pick someone. I mean, if you're the counterterrorism advisor to the president and they don't get around to picking someone to replace you for the next president, what do you do, like, on Inauguration Day? What do you do with all your stuff? Do you just burn everything in a trash can and go home? Do you lock the door behind you when you leave? What do you do? The transition has had some weird elements. I mean, there's the fact that it's still being run out of Trump's house. They're still not using the transition offices taxpayers pay for in D.C. It's also proceeding at a weird pace with priorities that sometimes don't make sense. For example, it's been 31 days since the election. On every one of those days, the intelligence community's prepared a president's daily brief that they've made available to the incoming president. But Reuters reported last night that the incoming president has only actually sat down and taken 4 of those briefings. 4 out of 31. He's been very busy, holding rallies for himself and stuff, while he has turned down 27 of the 31 intelligence briefings he's been offered. Also, there's no counterterrorism advisor. That said, today we learned that there are elements of the transition that are going ahead super aggressively. The former director of federal affairs for Koch Industries is heading up the transition for the Energy Department. Bloomberg News is first to report that at Energy, the transition's now sent over a list of 65 questions for the Obama Energy Department, including demands for the names of individual employees who've worked on climate change. They want to know who went to climate change meetings, who worked on what climate change issues. They want names. Washington Post reports that they've also demanded names from top scientists at the nation's national laboratories. They want scientists' names, their salaries, their publications, their professional affiliations, everything they have put their name to as scientists. Now, the worry here is obvious. I mean, everybody expects the incoming administration is going to try to destroy what the Obama administration has done on a lot of scientific issues. You make those intentions clear when you put the chief lobbyist for Koch Industries in charge of setting up this part of the administration, right? And you name an EPA administrator who mostly just wants to abolish the EPA. You make that clear, right? But this new worry with this new reporting is not just that they're going to change policy, or they're going to remove and replace people who Obama appointed in all the science parts of the administration. The worry here is that they're going to go after people who Obama didn't appoint. They're going to go after the lifelong civil servants. They're going to go root out scientists and staffers who aren't political appointees, but who committed the Republican sin of working on science that the right doesn't believe in. I mean, replacing political appointees is expected. Scouring the names of all the civil servants to root out all the permanent staffers, that would be radical. I mean, not everything is designed to turn over with every new president. That ends up being a really interesting potential break on radicalism for the next administration. And there is a hot, hot, hot story about